I'm going to be brief, unlike the Hall of Fame and Honor While. It was terrific, but I'll be very brief. Elliott Trommald is an American original. He was a master teacher here from 1962 to 68. He was an interim teaching in Australian University, and he came back for the 77-85 period, and then broke all our hearts by going up to Middlesex and having another storied career in prep school in New England. Of course, his love of John I. Blair and research and all that stemmed from that period between 62 and 85, and he's been involved ever since. If you go back 50 years or more, maybe even the post-war period, there are a few names that built this school. Ferd Marcial, Henry Cowan, we're in Cowan Auditorium, Charlie Underwood, and certainly Elliott Trommald. These guys came here and built this school. They didn't have the giant library. They didn't have Annie Hall. They didn't have Armstrong Kipling's. They didn't have this building. They didn't have Catherine. They didn't have Lakeside. And they didn't have the CI. They didn't have all that bricks and mortars. But when I came here and was recruited by Elliott, I came not for the buildings, but because this was a vibrant community, and he was at the center of it, along with a few other people. And we shouldn't forget that we owe a hell of a lot to those people. And I'm forever grateful to my friend Elliott for introducing me to this community, and it's been a love affair ever since. We have the world expert on John I. Blair. No one else knows about it. But there are a few people in the world that know something about the elusive fellow, and this is one of them. Elliott.
Yeah, we've been talking a lot about this elusive search, and I'm going to try to go fairly quickly now because I'm supposed to speak for no more than 30 minutes. We've used up 10. I don't know how I'm going to do that, but I would be remiss if I did not say, those of you who were at the athletic event this morning at 10 o'clock, and I even get choked up, but you really saw something that is key to this school, and that's the word character. The athletic and academic interrelationship was so clearly stated there and felt, I think, by everybody in that room. And when Blake was speaking, I don't know if anybody else was speaking at that, I mean, I was teary-eyed. I asked Joe afterwards when he was giving the loud talk, I said, "Were you on the verge of tears?" And he said, "Yeah." And it happens a lot with this school, largely because of that issue, character, and that's what it's about. And Marty was saying something about that. But in 1989, there was a Blairstown sesquicentennial, and the paper said, "It's a mystery in Blairstown why the municipality's namesake, John I. Blair, isn't more famous. Why isn't Blair in the history books, alongside his more well-known contemporaries?" Part of my task has been to try to answer that question, which I have been unable to do. But I will continue to read it. One of the answers may look at the obituaries. They appeared in at least 42 of the 45 states. I know that. But the one in the New York Times may hit closest to the point. The politics of the papers that gave the obituaries were rather interesting, because they wrote obits if you were a progressive, if you were a populist, if you, whatever your interest was that dominated that paper, then that's the Blair you saw. But listen to the New York Times in 1899, writing, and this is only a very small piece of it, but I love it. "Mr. Blair's habits were always simple and unpretentious, and his acquirement of millions made little change in his mode of living. His garments were usually ill-fitting and shabby, and he looked in his walks much like a figure left over from the last century." That's the 1700s. "He never drank liquor or smoked, and he used to say gleefully that he had never speculated, attended a horse race, or a baseball game, and had only been once to a theater. The house in which he lived nearly all his life is on a hill, back of the post office. It is a large two-story frame building painted white. It was furnished with a sparseness that suggested poverty. But John I. Blair thought it and Blairstown the paradise of the world. And you hear something about that, you don't necessarily want to take him out for coffee, which is the thing to do today. What interests me is there's more interest in Blair in the 21st century than there was in the 20th century. But the truth is still just as elusive. We live with myths of him, and these myths are hardening in the 21st century. So who is the man? I think I can do this. We just do this. That, if you look at that, that is the man that Jim Howard, some of you were here when he was here, would look at that guy and say, would you buy a used car from him? And always thought he looked a little shady. Marty Miller sits here and he says, you know, he looks just like Dave McCulloch. And we just were comparing the photographs. Only difference is in most of Blair's pictures, including the bust, the lips turn like this, McCulloch's turn like this. And that does make somewhat of a difference. Now wait, hold on. No, this one isn't working, Marty. I can't look. It's not changing. The battery's gone. But we'll keep going. At any rate, what I want to do today is to give you 4 pieces of his life. And I'm going to have to really... there we go. There we go. Really good. This is supposed to have been done in 1883. I don't think it was done in 1883. It sits in the bowels of the New York Metropolitan Museum of Art. It's seldom, as far as I know, ever been brought up for viewing, but that's where it is. There are 2 busts like that were in the family, and we have one in the library. But if you look at him, and I've stared at that statue for quite a while, to be honest with you, I don't particularly like him, just looking at the statue. But he is a man that is described by, I think, the New York Times fairly accurately. He spanned the 19th century, and he was an example of 19th century entrepreneurial capitalism at its height. The railroads created the wealth of this country, and the fortunes we still have today really do come out of the railroads. The superhighway, the fiber optic superhighway, is creating a new group of multi-billionaires. But he was the one that probably, I think, exemplified the entrepreneurial piece best and did it most successfully. You've got to remember, after 1870s, especially the period 1861, the beginning of the Civil War, to 1877, when the presidency was bought in a political scam, that's when he made his money. And when he began to lose his money was when all of a sudden, not all of a sudden, but interlocking directorates, finance capitalism, monopoly capitalism, replaced the entrepreneurial capitalism, the role of the individual. So what I want to talk about are 4 periods. I want to look at the local chapter where he made it big in New Jersey and made himself well known in the New Jersey, New York, Pennsylvania area. And then I want to look at the national chapter where he made the wealth we all talk about, particularly in the 21st century. Then look at his foray into politics just for a moment when he ran for governor in 1868. And then Blair Academy, and then his death. And those are 4 small pieces of it. Had a 4th grade education. At the age of 10, he decided he didn't want any more of it, and he said, it's time for me to make money, and he went from Foul Rift, where he was born, to a little place called Hope. And there he started a couple of stores. First, he worked for his cousin, John Blair. He was born, incidentally, John Blair, but when he worked with his cousin, John Blair, to say the difference between them, the I comes in. Now he's John I. Blair, but he wasn't born that way. The stores were rather big for that time, and he made a chain store world for himself. There were stores in Lawrenceville, Stroudsburg, Haynesburg, Marksboro, so that's quite a distance. And in order to work those stores, he created 3 or 4 flour mills, and you'll remember this one, if it works. Oh boy, I'll tell you technology.
You're going to have to stay up there, Marty.
Yeah. You know the flour, how do you do it? Oh, I got the wrong thing. I was looking at the pointer. All right, that was the flour mill, and that's actually the mill which you all remember is this one, and it's the bottom of that mill that the papers that I have were found. They were rat-eaten, they were they were wet, they were soggy, there were feces all over them. We actually, Dennis Peachy found them. And he said, Elliott, you might want to do something with this. So I took them, and I've had them ever since. He continued to work in that area until 1825, when the town changed its name to Gravel Hill. Prior to that, it had been Rocky Hill, which was called Rocky L, then Smith's Bridge, and then it was called Butts Bridge, and now it's going to be called Gravel Hill. And he becomes the postmaster, which was great, because now all of the mail coming in and all of the shipping going out was free, because he had the franking privilege, which postmasters have. 1826, that's one of his first stores, still now housing a faculty member. And then in 1826, he married this rather dour woman we know very little about, and he never talked about, or talked very little about. And Nancy, to his cousins and friends, I don't know what he called her. It was usually Mrs. Blair. I've never seen anything in print or in a letter of his where he doesn't refer to his wife as Mrs. Blair. That's Ann Law. Stiff. They had 4 children, 2 gals, 2 boys. 3 of the children died young, 2 during the Civil War, 1 in 1873, and DeWitt Clinton, who then, of course, inherited all the money, in 1915. And he is the father of Ledyard Blair. Okay, that's where he comes. 1840s and 50s, he also gets involved in mining. And he manufactures nails, which he sells in his stores. Two Scrantons he hired to run stores, and then he backed them, financed them up in Slocum's Hollow, which was then named Scranton. And he became sort of a founder of the Delaware Coal and Iron Company, and then the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Railroad. And more importantly, he really ran the Warren Railroad, which was the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western's key to getting to New York City. And that was a very important railroad. And he engineered tunnels. Very able, worked all the time. Okay, that gets us to 1845. He actually, as early as 1831, was able to say that he was the wealthiest man in northwestern New Jersey. And you should see the papers. Every penny is accounted for, 5 sheets of this scrap-heared paper. And it is fascinating to me that, oh, that's this one. He was able to do it. During that period, he built this house, the homestead. You may have seen it, Blake, because that was a great house, the one that the New York Times describes as sparse, figures, furnished in poverty. But it was torn down in the 1870s because Blair Academy. Thank you very much. The 1970s. Blair Academy needed the money, and the town had certain financial interests in it, so they tore it down. All that was taken from it were a few banisters, but not much of the goods. I never saw the inside. Students used to throw rocks at it, break windows, and it wasn't in very good shape when they did tear it down. We would have hoped it would have continued to exist. But that puts him in New Jersey as a key figure. Now, in 1860, he goes to the Republican Convention. And there, with Oakes Ames, who had manufactured shovels, which he sold in his store, and was also on the ground floor of Transcontinental Railroad interests. We're talking about building a Transcontinental Railroad. And after going to the convention where they elected Lincoln, or appointed Lincoln, nominated Lincoln, he goes out to Iowa. And there gets quite interested. He sees great possibilities. Goes back by Springfield to visit Lincoln, and at Springfield he writes in his memorandum book, I told him, meaning Lincoln, I told him and her when I left that I expected to call on them at Washington when they got to the White House, but I should ask for no office. I found he was very temperate. They gave us cold water, nothing else. He neither drinks rum, chews, or smokes. That was important to him. He wouldn't even let people that worked in his stores chew, drink, or told them not to. I don't know that they followed it. But at any rate, that led to his being appointed on the first board of the Union Pacific Railroad once the Pacific Railroad Act was passed in 1862. He did not like the leader of that board, a guy named Dr. Durant, who he thought was crooked, and did not get along well with him. But he looked at the picture and he said, you know, I don't have to be in the Transcontinental. Union Pacific goes from Council Bluffs and Omaha west. What if I had the road from Chicago to Council Bluffs? Well, there were 3 roads racing across Iowa because every time you built 10 miles of track, you got oodles of land. And that's exactly what he did. He got off the board was reconstituted in 1864, he wanted no part of it. Instead, in 1864, he was already working on the Cedar Rapids and Missouri River Railroad. In fact, he beat out the Rock Island and he beat out the Burlington. He was the first to get there, and that's where most of his money, I think, was made. He feasted during the Civil War. The competitors, a lot of the able competitors in Iowa, Nebraska, Minneapolis, and those new towns that were going up, they left to fight in the war. They needed railroad builders in order to repair bridges, to build new roads in order to help the war effort. Blair stayed focused on moving from Cedar Rapids all the way out through Council Bluffs. And he raced them, he beat them, he completed construction of sections of the line ahead of schedule, and he earned a bonus guaranteed by the contract. He platted towns, named them after his family, and in most of those towns, if you look at them today, not today, but if you look at the plaques of the original town, the Blair's Addition will be the biggest chunk of land in the center of the city that would grow, and also it would be the land around the railroad station. That was true in Sioux City, it was true in Ames. He named Ames, Iowa after Oaks Ames. He made one for Aurelia. There's Aurelia, Iowa. There's Marcus, his son's Iowa. There's Scribner. His daughter married Charles Scribner, and he actually bankrolled Scribner in getting him started in the printing business. So what we have is somebody who's really interested. But the elusive search, we have a magazine today called the Investor's Business Daily. This is where Miss Hardin had a long, inaccurate piece on Blair in January of 2015, a couple of years ago. And I'm reading from the Investor's Business Daily. Forming a partnership with Representative Oaks Ames of Massachusetts and Thomas Durant, a physician and financier in Iowa, Blair received a charter in 1862 to build the Union Pacific track west from Omaha, Nebraska to Promontory Summit, Utah. Just not true. But that article has been repeated in other articles where they're talking about entrepreneurial capitalism. In 1870, he was the railroad king of Iowa. He had gathered 2.5 million acres of Iowa land. And this land became more valuable. He created a colonial system where he tried to get Europeans to come to this area, and you'll see a book with 3 different inexpensive houses that could be built on the land. Throughout, I've got to quit it, I've got to stop here, right? He avoided, throughout his time in Iowa, he avoided getting tangled in the political machinations of the transcontinentals. Quickly, what he did was he became president of the railroads, well over 11 of them. Then he created construction companies that would build the railroads. So the president of the railroad would pay for the construction company, and he was the president of the construction companies. And then he created land companies where all the land would be deposited and be sold in order to construct the railroads. So he had these 3 different areas that allowed him to control what was happening, and he didn't tell anybody about it. That's the beautiful part, because I went and said, I got to see these articles of association. I spent a lot of time in Sioux City and Des Moines. The county auditor in Sioux City and the state archivist, who I met with several times in Des Moines, said, oh yeah, the Articles of Association for the Iowa Railroad Land Company is here. I'll get it for him. Didn't get it. Well, make a long story short, I had 3 archivists working with me trying to find it. They never did find it, and they said, this is very puzzling. Well, between both railroads and construction companies and land companies, you have another thing that's difficult to search. The Iowa Railroad Land Company sold the Blairtown Lot and Land Company, which was bigger than the Iowa Railroad Land Company initially, but he's just shifting it around. If you walked through the gym, you saw an Iowa Railroad Land Company stock certificate. That's one that was in these books we found in the bottom of the flour mill. They were never filled in as far as I know. We had several hundred pages of these. For 3 different companies. I gave them to Jim Kelly, or I gave them to maybe Dennis Peachy, and I think the business office used them in order to give donors to Blair a certificate which is suitable for framing. I saw some of them, and I think a number of people maybe in this room have them. And I don't know what they were ever used for. I've never seen one that was actually real in the sense of money. So let me just stop right here and talk about the big figures. In 1878, Chicago newspaper wrote that John I.B. was the controller of more railroad miles than anyone in the world. This century, we have in 2007, that's 130 years after Blair sort of lost it, an article in the New York Times outlining the 30 wealthiest men in the history of the United States. John I. Blair was number 21 in that group at $43 billion in terms of $2,000, using that thing. J.P. Morgan was number 24. The only 2 living Americans on that list were Gates and Buffett. And they were, I believe, number 5 and 17, something like that. Then Malcolm Gladwell, tipping point man, wrote The Outliers, the story of success, in 2008. He then has a list in that book, if you have it, of the 75 richest people in global economic history. Blair makes that list twice. Now you go figure. He is number 47. John Blair, 45.1 billion, and then in parentheses, the Union Pacific. And then John Inslee Blair, number 52, 42.4 billion, Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Railroad. J.P. Morgan was number 57. Once again, the only 2 living Americans on that list of global economic wealth were, again, Bill Gates at number 37 and Warren Buffett at number 41. Gates was 58 billion and Buffett at 52 billion. On all of the lists, John D. Rockefeller was number 1. Now, historians make all sorts of mistakes, and I wanted to, because I'm a historian, I'd love going into that, but I was going to really take David Bain's Empire Express to task. Just poorly researched. And part of it understandable because people couldn't read his writing, and they don't really know exactly what the facts are. Malcolm Gladwell, I'm really amazed at that myth of John I. Blair, but he's a Canadian journalist, although he's English born, and he does run a podcast called Revisionist History, which may explain some of it. He's very popular. Okay, this guy had a very checkered reputation. You can talk about it. Ask me later. I wanted to give you 2 stories, but we don't have time if I'm going to get to the school. I'm going to jump, and I can fill this in. One person that gives this sense of what happened when he started the work. When he started the Cedar Rapids, Missouri River Railroad, he had a contractor named Nilo Smith. He worked with him, and then Blair fired him, and then he went out to fight in the Civil War, came back at the end, sued him, a long case, and his attorney wrote a letter. Sounds very much like a Comey Trump type of situation. He said about the fact, he says, this is to John I. Blair, you incite legislation hostile to all corporations by neglecting to abide by your own articles of incorporation and the laws of the state. you reside out of state, keep your records, to be more specific, you carry these records in your breeches pockets or wherever else it may suit your convenience. Under your Articles of Association as the Iowa Railroad Contracting Company, your place of business was fixed at Cedar Rapids. You have no office there. There were no records there. And then concludes, if you intended violation of our laws, you could not have gone much further. If you did not intend such violation, it must have been the result of gross carelessness, ignorance, or stupidity. Now, that was in the courts, and there's going to be even worse things in the courts to come. But that gives you some sense, and I can give you 7 or 8 of these stories that are fascinating to read. Now, the next thing he did is he runs just at the end of his success. After the Civil War, he becomes the Republican nominee for governor of New Jersey in 1868. This is the year after Blair Hall burned, and the year before he paid to rebuild it. But he let his name be put into the nomination. I asked, why did he run? And that's a question I would love to be able to ask. I don't know whether it is that he felt that people might like him a little more. I sort of wonder whether there was not a need for self-promotion, and that's another entire issue that we could talk about. But he was terrible. He was inept as a speaker. Horace Greeley, who assisted him in his campaign, said more than once that John I. Blair's check is good for $5 million, but his speeches ain't worth a damn. And he gave only one major speech the entire time. I think basically the Republican Party threw it to the wolves and wanted that money to succeed in other races that they had a chance of winning. Blair lost. And it's important to think a little bit about Blair. Blairstown, which was not named by the citizens of Blairstown, Blair requested that the citizens name the town Blairstown in 1839. It was called Gravel Hill right into the 1860s and 70s. But he lost Blairstown in this election by 9 votes, and he lost Warren County by 2-1. Okay, now, the fact is there, but you do what you want with the facts. What does that mean? That's something that is interesting. What fascinates me is there is no recorded evidence that I have found of any disappointment that he had lost it. What he did, it was 3 or 4 days after the election, he took off for New York and Boston to do business, came back a few days in Blairstown, and then left for Iowa, Nebraska, and the Dakotas. In early December, not returning until the first of the year. You read his memorandum book. This is an entry, the last entry. I gave Mrs. Blair $5.66. That was the last entry and the only mention of his wife in that year. So he had a memorandum book every year, and that was the only mention of it. The only fascinating thing we have time to say, he did receive, while he was in Iowa, he received a Christmas wire. He hadn't gotten home yet. From his nephew, who was in Larned, Kansas, and his nephew actually went to Blair Academy. But the nephew wrote, writing to wish you a happy Christmas and New Year and many other years in which to enjoy life and build railroads. That's sort of even in the 19th century, that's sort of cute, isn't it? So he was home New Year's Eve. The election hardly a memory. Okay, now, the last thing I wanted, now we got the governor out of the way, the Blair Academy. His interest in education, I suspect, was due to his children. Both Marcus and DeWitt Clinton flunked out of the schools that they were put in. Marcus at Flushing Institute in Long Island couldn't tolerate the rules and regulations of the school, and he told his dad, if you don't take me out, I'm coming out, and really attacked the headmaster. So what Blair did is he pulled him out, and Marcus said, I want to go to West Point. And Dad said, you're not going to West Point, you're going up into Pennsylvania to work with the Scrantons. And he worked on railroads the rest of his life until he died in 1873. Very sad story. The relationship between Dad and Marcus and what Marcus died of, again, is something that we can argue about. DeWitt Clinton was at Mount Pleasant Academy, principal writes, John I, disobedience, insubordination, and the deliberate and reckless smashing, defacing, and mutilating propensities of your son Clinton. And John I. Blair didn't like the principal saying that. They actually pulled him out, and he becomes one of the first enrollees of Blair Academy. And we have here, this is still the thing. Oh, I forgot to show you. This is the poster, the Colfax 1868 poster. But here is the founder of Blair Academy. Blair was built or developed just before Clinton was pulled out of Flushing. It's interesting that the school, this school's website says Blair Academy was founded in 1848 when wealthy merchant and railroad tycoon John Inslee Blair proposed the establishment of a school to the Presbyterian Church and the town fathers of Blairstown. Not true either. The true founders of the school are John Buddle and John Riley. John Riley, this one right here, was the only college-bred man in town. And the other one was the pastor of the Presbyterian Church and an elder. They took the lead in discussing education and trying to get a school, doing it for 2 years. And then in 1848, at a public meeting in the Presbyterian Church, the building committee was appointed, and John I. Blair was asked to join it. He had deep pockets, and he was the major landholder in the area, and his contribution literally did see the school through some tough times. And there was not a great deal of public recognition for what he did give. He did erect the Academy building. This one right here, whoops, I'm not good at this. Here we go. Go back. Right here, these wings were put on in 1855 because it got more students. This one is still there. You saw it just down by South Cottage. That's the original school. And a blanket divided the two sides, the public school on the left side and the academy on the right side in its origin. He did give a generous gift in 1875 to the endowment of $100,000, which would have been about $2 million in 2015 dollars. Later adding another $25,000, but that was basically the extent of his gift. And in the 1840s, we go on, and he built a railroad in Blairstown, which again, you've seen this both in the gym. This is the old dinky railroad, the late 87, John D. Vail took care of him, built in the late 1870s. And you saw a picture of the Phoebe Stowe also in the athletic center, which I found wonderfully surprising, that stuck in there with the winnings of the different teams. But this was the one that he built in order to get himself to New York easiest, because it'd take it to Delaware, and then he'd get the Delaware-Lackawanna Western into New York. But it also brought students from New York to Blair Academy. And Blair Academy actually thrived in the 1870s. Very good headmaster. The only two competitive schools, ones I think you've heard of, they were little schools. One was the Hicetown Female Seminary, which became, not cemetery, it's a seminary, and it became in 1872 Petty. And the other one was the Maidenhead Academy, which I'm sure all Blair boys would have been interested in. But the Maidenhead Academy was organized in 1812, and that then became Lawrenceville in 1883. But Blair was on it in the 1870s. Blair did incredibly well. And it's interesting. Everybody likes the idea that Blair gave a lot of money. As some of you have heard Jack Bogle speak a couple of years ago about there wasn't a lot of money given by him. It's interesting, in the will, where people thought a lot of money would go to Blair, you should know that his bequest to Blair on page 5 of the will was $15,000. And it was in lucrative railroad bonds. But then on page 25 is this clause. In case I should give the Blairstown Presbyterian Academy $15,000 in my lifetime, then the bequest I have herein made shall be void. it was void because the last 25,000 had been given before 1878. Now Bogle lamented that, and it's interesting, Jack Bogle gave half his salaries to charities during his flush years at Vanguard, and in 2004, Time magazine represented him as one of the 100 most influential people in the world. That was not something, I think, that would have happened in the 19th century to our namesake here. Maybe I'll just throw this in, and then we're going to kill it. I think it's important to also recognize that Blair was certainly focused on what he wanted to do, and that was his entire life. He took Charles Vail, who was personal secretary, died in 1886, took him out of Princeton. Vail did not want to leave Princeton, and Charles Vail was probably the greatest supporter this school had. And he did most of the work for the school. He appointed the heads. And Vail, at the end of his life in the 1880s, said, "I've wasted my life." He said, working as I did with the railroads and with Blair meant very little. And he said, I wish I had spent my time working with the school," which I found very interesting, and I also found it very poignant. And it's interesting, when he died, John D. Vail, who had been caring for him, was asked to take on his job on the Presbyterian Academy, the Blair Academy, and declined to do it. He was still taking care of John I. And so John D. Vail's, this train was named for, his younger brother, William Penn Vail, then becomes, he has to leave his medical, he's been a doctor for 17 years, he leaves his medical practice and spends the rest of his life dealing with the academy, which he actually liked, and he did a lot of very good things for the academy. I'm not going to go into any of the stories that are most fascinating, but they are written, and I think they'll be published in their review. If you want to ask about them, I'd be happy to talk to you about them, showing the entrepreneurial capitalists getting bested by the interlocking directorates and friendships between people who had worked together being completely destroyed as a consequence of differences of opinion, which were taken into the courts, but because there were no written records, as one man once said, the only thing you had was my honor. That was his defense, which got him freed from John I. Blair. But the will was a mind-numbing nightmare. And I will not go into that other than to say it was one where so many of the roads and investments that he had no longer existed in the form that they were, and there were incomplete papers. And that was never really sorted out until DeWitt Clinton he just created new things so that the children and the grandchildren were going to get what they wished to get. So I just want to say in conclusion, what do we know of Blair? Here's an incredibly interesting life. He is an important economic figure in the 19th century. Tells us a lot about how this country grew. And it took people like Blair with that focus to do it. At what cost? That's again a wonderfully interpretive question, great for discussion, particularly amongst secondary schools and secondary school students and university students. You've seen this sign also. I think it's over in the. This is his family. I think this is 1893, just after a Supreme Court case. He took a $807 stenographer's bill all the way to the Supreme Court because he wanted the guy who he didn't like, wanted him to pay the cost of the stenographer. Here he is. Not a happy-looking guy, but then again, he may have been very ill, and I have no idea who any of these other people are. I don't even know the year that picture was taken, but it sort of summarizes his life. So what we have is that he did put this out, which again is always concerning. Some of you may have seen this in the library. Can you read that back there? Here it is, 1883, which is the time at which his career has gone downhill. He's lost battles in the courts. And he's simply, it's funny, he didn't really make a lot of noise. The first one that he lost in 1880, he thought he was right and that the railroad was his. And it turned out they had done a deal behind his back by selling a railroad to a Boston group. And then they issued more stock so that Blair no longer had the majority share. And what did Blair finally do when the lawyers told him? He scratched his head after calling them in and went home. Never did a thing. The newspapers were fantastic, and those will all come, about wanting to look at Blair as being defeated. And they were nasty newspaper articles, but they represented Grange thinking and the populist thinking that were upset with what the railroads were doing in the West. So that's all part of history. It's a fascinating part of history. And what makes it fascinating with Blair, you never really know. And the books that are written that have Blair as a central figure, the authors, Dan Hodis wrote a book on Moses Taylor, and when I met him at a historical conference, he saw my Blair tag, he said, that Blair cat, that John I. Blair, said, I'm the only man in the United States who knows anything about John I. Blair. And so I asked him, I said, what do you mean? He said, well, recent 21st century effort at historical preservation that has entered the picture that will keep the competition alive, I guess, as to who knows John I. Blair best. And the interesting question for me then is, how will we come to know John I. Blair in the 21st century? And that's what I'm going to say now. That there's so much to this story that, that we're not talking about today, but it's something that I hope some of you might pursue, and I'm hoping the school will pursue it. But I would like to take what time we have left to take any questions or to go into areas that we haven't got into.
PPAC, what happened to that building? Who owns it? What did it turn into, that beautiful mansion that was restored?
Which
I'd like to go down and see it, the one in PPAC.
PPAC, oh, you have to do it by invitation. And it is owned by a private corporation. The people are living in it. They've done it. Blair has been, when that was built in the early 20th century, they carved off the top of a mountain. And then they created a man-made, it's called Ravine Lake. And they had people in gondolas poling around in it. And some of the greatest parties at the time. I have talked to family members over the last 10 or 15 years. The one that I knew best was Blair Clark. One of the Ledger's daughters married William Clark. And his son Blair Clark. Any of you know Blair Clark? He had been a fascinating individual, but he spat venom when he talked about Ledger. Others had said that, well, that was where all the money went. He was on the New York Yacht Club. He was a trustee here until I think the 1950s, I believe. 1940s. Made fame for himself during World War II when I think he led a boat that had been torpedoed or something into New York Harbor. But an interesting guy. I don't know much about him. I know that his grandson appeared here when we had a skeptics, and I was really embarrassed because I'd said this, and I talked to him. I said, I'm just telling you what I know from the records I've seen. And he also seemed to, he didn't seem surprised by it. But the villas out in California, they have also made similar statements to me. I talked to Ann Casey, who lived in PPAC, and she had a lot of papers. I don't know what's happened to them. But I used those papers for 3 years. I went down and researched them. And she was talking, I think it was she who told me, he said, Elliott, when that will was looked at, he said it was a swamp of conflicting railroad information that nobody could make sense out of. And so the will wasn't finally finished until 1906 or 07, somewhere in that. That's another story which I stayed away from. Yes?
Could you speak maybe a little bit more about the settlements or the colonization that he tried to encourage? And potential follow-up is, did he have any say over how Ames or the other cities that he gave tracts of land to didn't have any say over how they developed, and so could he maybe have an impact on the culture of those towns?
How they develop, this is where you hear, and again, how legend hardens. The stories about giving 100 churches in Iowa, building 100 churches, not true, but he did give money to church. He gave a lot to Princeton, he gave a lot to Lafayette, he gave some to Grinnell, he gave some to Cone. But what you're asking is interesting. I have no recognition of him doing anything in terms of the, and I don't say that negative, it's just that there's nothing there. The land is there, he wants to develop it, but he moves on to a new railroad. After Sioux City was really thriving, that was his favorite railroad. It runs down the Missouri River on the east or western side of Iowa. He said, oh my God, the Dakotas, there's going to be this gold up here, they need a railroad. So he bought a railroad going up into Yankton and did very well with it. Just as he did down in Kansas towards the end, the Osceola, which he, you know, what he would do is he would build these railroads, then he would look for somebody to lease them to, and he would charge them. And that's where a lot of the money came in, but I don't know where that money is, and I don't know how much it is. And that's why all of this business of finding out a fortune of, if you say it's 43 billion and 20, it doesn't mean anything to me. It means people have decided, well, let's just take it. It could be out of air. You know, he's had all of this land, then he must have had this, then he must have, that's must have been. And that is the beauty of history. You know, history, you know, Trump was right. The history is basically, what do you call it? We get the newspapers and we make fake news. And then we make alternative facts. But then we have facts. But facts mean absolutely nothing until people pour meaning into them. So honest people take exactly the same fact and they come up with a totally different story. And that story has a life of its own and oftentimes can influence politics. Sometimes determine political decisions. And that's why I'm very upset that science STEM courses have taken over the world. Without history and those types of things, you don't have a context in which to look at things. And even though you may not get the correct context, at least you have an honest debate going on and people recognizing, well, maybe this isn't the way. Maybe we should, you got to think about these things. But of course, the problem with politics, no time for reflection. Historians have, I've been reflecting for since 19, thank you very much back there. Yeah, and that's, I mean, that's, the historians get to do that. Other questions? If not, you get to go. I will tell you one story at the end about Schaefer. I just love this because I've spent so much time dealing with it and trying to trace it down. In 1880 to 83, again, a partner of his decides that he was going to, he ended up in Blair's mind of gypping him out of about maybe $20,000 worth of land. 25 years earlier, Allie was a good friend of his who had given Blair a piece of land on which he made 400% on the land deal. Well, he then attacked Schaefer. I have, and I'll send it to you, the ream, 1,200 pages of case history on this. He sued him. And it went to court. First, they got Schaefer in jail, in Kansas City Penitentiary. There he met a guy named Charles, and he said, look, we got to kill this guy. So made a pact to kill Blair, and when Charles Allen was his name, he got out, and Charles said, well, I know an anarchist down in New Orleans, and the two of us will go up to Blairstown and we'll go off him. And he went down and got this guy, and they moved up, and he kept asking Schaefer. Schaefer got out on an early release, and one that gave him a little more money. Story is, at least this is what John I. Blair, we do have this from him. He thought it was for real. Told his lawyer that was handling it was in Kansas at the time, because that was where the Kansas Penitentiary was. And the lawyer's son was going to Blair Academy as well, that's nice. What happened is he had supposedly knocked on the door at the mansion and said, I've been paid $10,000 to kill you. What will you give me? The story is Blair said, you're talking to the wrong person, see my lawyer down in Kansas. Supposedly, Allen left. I have these pencil-written notes from Allen, and none of it makes a lot of sense, except Blair keeps asking, he said, look, what's going on here? I can show you what you know had to be real, at least in somebody's mind, because some of this is in the Supreme Court hearings. In 1993, this case ultimately, from 1883, he pursued it until his death. And it was not until 1993 it got into the Supreme Court. It had been the U.S. Circuit Court, sent back to a Missouri court, back into the circuit, and then to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court made a sort of a split decision. They said, now you got to pay some of this. The other guy has to pay some of it. And he didn't even like that decision, so he had his family, when he was very ill the last 4 years of his life, continuing to work on it. And the last letter on it is 1897, when Blair is really, like you saw him in the picture. And he writes, he says to him, he says, dear grandfather, this is in July 26, 97. The dutiful grandson, who is now working at Blair and Company on Wall Street. He created an investment house that became Bank of America, took it over finally, but in 1890. And he said, dear grandfather, he informed him he had to pay the U.S. Supreme Court because it had reduced, but he said the residue of costs could not be collected from you. To avoid further costs, we paid $807.75, which I will protest with your previous instruction covering these matters. And I see that. That's somebody who is focused. He really hated. Schaefer finally fled to Canada. But the other cases that I could give you, the one of Alley, that doesn't matter. It does become a fascinating insight into our history. And some of it is not too different from where we are today. I can't look at this, and I say, no, don't look at this. This is not a Comey situation, or this is not a Watergate situation. And it's dangerous doing that because the context of the 19th century is so different from the context of the late 20th and the early 21st century. But the story is yet to be told. But it's worth pursuing if you have nothing else to do.
Thank you.